Hello, everybody. Welcome to A Matter of Personal Taste, a Tales from the Crypt podcast. I'm your co-host, Martin Fisher here, and I'm here with my buddy Andy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming back. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, thank you for not leaving us after one episode. We appreciate that.
We're going to get better, we promise.
It all takes a little bit of time getting used to the whole format and everything. We're glad you liked the first episode enough to want to come hear our opinions on another episode. And today we're going to be talking about The Man Who Was Death, which is, I'm going to say, one of my favorites from this first season. I was surprised on the set. I did a rewatch of it in preparation for this, and I was floored by how much I like the style of the episode.
Yeah, I rewatched it a couple nights ago in preparation for this too. And what I liked about it was this one, I think even more than an All Through the House, has like a real comic book vibe to it, where like everyone's face is directly in the camera.
Right. Yeah. There's a really claustrophobic kind of feeling to this episode. And yeah, it feels directly ripped out of comic book. And it's from the like really dark shadows, like even more so than certain other episodes, because each episode has a different kind of lighting style. And this one really enunciates the shadows, and the music is really great. I really enjoyed revisiting this episode, and William Sadler is wonderful, and we'll get to that soon.
Me too. This was, again, like if anybody heard my backstory for Tales from the Crypt from last episode, this was one of my first introductions to Tales from the Crypt and anthology horror in general, because I rented the first season from the library. And I remember watching this episode because the first one I watched was in All Through the House, because that was like a slasher plot and that's what appealed to me. But then I just kind of, burned through the other ones. And this one surprised me because it was a little more disturbing than I anticipated. And going back to it now, I mean, obviously it's very comic booky, so it's not like The Exorcist or anything, but like when I was a kid and they open with that inmate being taken to the electric chair and he's like weeping and sobbing and like crying out for people and like telling them to just wait a minute, I was like, even as an adult, like I'm sitting there watching, I'm like, this is like actually a little bit upsetting.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's so funny too, because the tone of the episode kind of shifts when he becomes like this crazy slasher character. But that first one is so just makes your skin crawl. And then they kind of repeat it at the end, of course, when Sadler ends up getting caught at the end. He's doing the same exact thing that guy was doing. Kind of, he's sweating a little bit. He's not begging as much, but it's there's so much of this episode that's so dark and pretty disturbing. And I think a big part of that, of course, is it deals with, a touchy subject with, the death penalty and everything like that. So
Yeah, it's one of those things where it the tone of this will shift on a dime,
yeah.
which is what makes EC Comics so fun to read, because it'll go from like a super close up of someone's face as they're sweating and screaming, and you're like, and it's like just the most fun you've ever had. And then like, like there'll be a last panel where like the fate is revealed, or that just desserts twist, presents itself, and you're like, oh my god, like this is actually like really sad and disturbing. And that's the thing about the show, is because it was on HBO, they could take those to even further extremes than the comic could in the 50s. So like you start off again like with this really actually pretty unsettling scene of someone being taken to the electric chair, but it like has like this weird almost carnival music playing over it.
Yeah, I caught that. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, I was just gonna say, like, the music choice, the way they work the soundtrack on this is just bonkers.
It's interesting because even in the most disturbing moments, it maintains that playful Tales from the Crypt EC vibe.
Right. And I think a big part of that is down to the fact that a lot of the episode we are going through the perspective of Niles Talbot, William Sadler's character, and we kind of understand like his view on the world is a little skewed and a little different from the norm. And that's why, a moment that is just so just kind of gross is somehow seen as like a kind of carnivalesque, like here comes the big show moment instead. And I think that more so becomes apparent as you get like the other kills he starts to do later on in the episode, where they become kind of almost cartoonish.
Hmm. Yeah, like the couple in the hot tub, like the guy's eyes are like bugging out and he's like doing the over the top twitching thing and stuff. Like,
Yeah.
it is like it's almost like watching a Looney Tunes character get electrocuted. Like
Oh,
they,
big time.
yeah, it's just so over the top. But what I think is kind of great about that is the executions in this episode that are seen from both his perspective and others' perspectives, meaning the two executions at the beginning, at the end, that take
Mhm.
place in the prison, where there are other people around. Those are more realistic and like more disturbing. And then the ones that he is the ones that only he is witness to, like the gate or the couple in the hot tub, are like more cartoonish because you're seeing it through his unfiltered perspective. And this is probably how this dude views what he's doing, as like this
Right.
over the top cartoon hero moment.
Mhm. And I think it's a really interesting way of taking inspiration from the comic. This was based on a story in Crypt of Terror number 17, the series that would eventually become Tales from the Crypt in the EC Comics world. And the story it's based on kind of has that perspective where the character, he's not called Niles Talbot in the story, but the executioner character, he kind of like dresses up and becomes like his own little superhero because he's just completely off of his rocker at this point. And he's like, oh, I'll take justice in my own hands because, not enough guilty people are being, sent to the electric chair. So I'll do it myself. So he like dresses up in this like big trench coat and does these insane kills. Like he burns a guy to death in the shower. They carry over the one part where he electrocutes a guy through a gate. And there's this part where he's climbing up an electric tower, a pole, and he cuts like a wire so it can zap the guy down below. And he does this all dressed up.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great little carryover, I think, from that. And here's the thing too, is like a little bit different from And All Through the House is this one is definitely inspired by more so than straight up adapting, because it is a little bit different from the comic. And even just the people he goes after, the kills, they're all a little different than how they were. Because I mean, in the comic, the way they end up catching him is that he's about to kill someone and then a lightning strike happens and like their security guard sees him and jumps him basically. Whereas this, I think they really stick to having the perspective of the killer in the episode.
Yeah, and it's two different ways of going about it, because like you said, in the comic, the way he's dressing up, he's almost like the Shadow,
Right.
like he's like this like almost
Yeah.
pulp noir like Avenger
Mhm.
who just happens to be a psychopath. But what I also found interesting, now that we're comparing the comic and the episode, is that in the episode it seems much more clear cut that these people are guilty, whereas
Yeah.
in the comic, like I think they have like the guy who's in the shower even saying like, oh, I really hope they catch the person that actually killed them or something. Like
Yeah, exactly.
that's like that's a monologue to himself, so it's not like he's lying to himself. Like
Right.
it's clear that he's actually innocent. So in a way, the episode presents him as more of like a Punisher type character,
Right.
whereas the comic is like, this guy's just absolutely insane and living out this like fantasy of being an Avenger.
Yeah. And I think maybe a reason they didn't want to carry that part over is because even that might be a little too much for this kind of story. And even for Tales from the Crypt, I guess, with this kind of show, it might have been a bit much to have him dressed up as like a shadow wannabe and doing these things. And also, there just probably isn't enough time to kind of fit in like, oh, a character who was innocent, at least with the guy in the shower.
Right, exactly. And the thing about William Sadler that's so great in this episode is he's almost like this like taxi driver-esque protagonist, you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Whereas the comic, he's more of like a wannabe superhero.
Yeah.
This more of like he's like more of like a noir protagonist.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I'll just say, like, William Sadler is fucking amazing in this episode.
Oh yeah, that's the highlight of like all of these shows, because
Mhm.
you and I have seen many seasons of Tales from the Crypt prior to
Yeah.
recording this, is that every episode lets the guest star really shine
Hmm.
and do their thing and get as goofy and as campy as they want to get. So like the William Sadler being in here and doing all of his great little monologues to the camera about the way that like about how he gets women or the way that like society looks at him. It's just so awesome because like he's just chewing the scenery, you know?
Yeah. Oh, big time. And it's so delightful to see, because I mean, when I usually think of William Sadler, I think a lot of like his smaller roles, or like his roles that are more subdued, like he had in The Mist or Shawshank Redemption, where there are these meaty roles, but they are pretty reserved for the most part. Whereas this just lets him go for it. And boy, does he. My goodness.
Yes, and he's great in it because he is so he's really likable. Whereas
Yeah.
in the comic, the the protagonist is far less likable.
Right.
He's almost like Dr. Savannah from like from the Shazam comic.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
he's got that very like a skull kind of design sticking out of his head, basically. Yeah.
yeah, he looks like the typical mad scientist, you know.
Hmm.
And so to have William Sadler play not a wannabe superhero, but a likable noir protagonist who just happens to be like electrocuting people is so awesome, and I think really plays to the strengths of the medium of television as a like because the comic is great, like, and the comic is as exactly as the comic should be. But like you were saying, the show, this episode isn't like a one for one adaptation of it. It's
Hmm.
like inspired by it, and I think it works just as well as the way All from the House and All Through the House adapted straight up the story.
Right.
Like there's no weakness in either episode, and I think that shows what's so dynamic about this series as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, we're going to talk about Dig That Cat on the next episode. And each episode, these were the three that kind of started the show. They all premiered on the same day. And each highlights, the director's strong suit and everything. But they all are like a litmus test for what Tales from the Crypt can be at its best.
Mm.
And it can cover a variety of different kinds of stories, different kinds of tones. And it just they deliver such strong stories. And I mean, that's why I was so blown away watching this, because I mean, this was also my first episode that I had ever seen, and I told this in the last episode. This was the first episode I'd ever seen on TV of Tales from the Crypt, and I was kind of not old enough, I think, to appreciate it. And then when I watched it, when I got the DVD set of the series, I was really blown away by it. And tonally, it fits everything else that goes on in the show. It does have moments where it's utterly ridiculous. It does have moments where it gets kind of darkly disturbing. And I think that's what makes these first three episodes such a great, and I mean the first season in general, such a great showcase of what Tales from the Crypt can do. Because they all cover a variety of tones, and they just do it so expertly. Each episode is just so expertly crafted. I love this first season so much.
Yes, it's an all-star lineup of creators and talent both in front of and behind the camera. Because if you
Yeah.
think about it, like these three episodes, and we're going to get to Dig That Cat on our next episode,
Mhm.
but all three of the episodes that premiered on this night were directed by Walter Hill, Robert Zemeckis, and Richard Donner. Like,
Right. Like, my God, man, what a lineup.
yeah, and if you think about like the context of this, of like being a horror fan in the 90s, like where like people always reminisce about Blockbuster, but like your real only source of horror was renting movies,
Hmm.
or maybe like catching them on HBO or whatever. And then HBO comes along and they say like, and in one night you're going to get a new horror basically short film from Walter Hill, Robert Zemeckis, and Richard Donner. I mean, that, like, if you and I had been like sentient beings at the time it premiered, we would have, like, our minds would have been blown by this.
Oh, absolutely. Oh my God, I would have loved to have been there when it first premiered, because just, oh my God, the experience of having like such strong directors doing a show like this, at the time, is just such a strange concept.
And the idea that like at the same time, like, or relatively the same time as this show premiering, Russ Cochran was doing all of his like reprints of the classic EC stories.
Mhm.
Is so like so awesome. Like, I'm so glad that both this show and Russ Cochran could simultaneously sort of save these stories from obscurity, because like if it weren't for this show and it weren't for Russ Cochran, Tales from the Crypt would be just kind of like something you heard about from like maybe mentioned in interviews with Stephen King and George Romero and like R.L. Stein. And
Right.
you know, you could watch Creep Show and you could be like, well, these are what they were kind of like. You know
Mhm.
what I mean? Like, this is a pretty good this is a pretty good, you know, adaptation of what they were like. But in the early 90s, these two different products managed to like save what I think is some of the best comic book storytelling ever done in the medium.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's remarkable how much they were able to do at the time, in the 50s, and how much those stories are still so strong now today in the 2020s. I mean, my God, it speaks to just how much of a landmark EC Comics was with their horror stuff.
Yes, and what I love about it too is that EC Comics premiered in a relatively buttoned down, like, conservative era.
Right, depending
Like,
on your view, it could have been probably one of the worst eras for comics.
exactly, but they managed to like break through, and
Mhm.
in a time where like just Google any 50s Superman or Batman cover and you'll
Oh
see
yeah.
where comics were at the time. Like, they're playing beach ball, you know, and I mean, on the cover, or like Superman is wearing an apron and like vacuuming his house, you know what I
Right.
mean?
Batman's choosing which colored suit he wants to wear for the day.
Exactly. And you can imagine being like 12 years old and like sitting, or you know, standing at the magazine rack or at the spinner rack at your local drugstore in the day and seeing like, well, in this episode, you know, Ace the Bat Hound's being naughty. So how are Batman and Robin going to deal with this? And then you spin that spinner rack, and then on the other side is like someone being buried alive on the cover of Tales from the
Right.
Crypt. It's no wonder why they were like the most popular comics of the time. And what I think is so cool about that is that when Tales from the Crypt premiered, it was also coming out of a relatively buttoned down, you know, censored era, because you know, you and I are both huge slasher fans,
Mhm.
and if you watch slasher movies as much as we do, they get progressively more neutered throughout the decade of the 80s,
Yeah.
as like, you know, video nasties became a big thing and people started cracking down on horror. So like by the time Tales from the Crypt premiered, you know, you were on like Friday the 13th part 8, but like all the gore was edited out of it.
Right. Just think of, like, oh, the first Friday the 13th where the arrow goes through Kevin Bacon's neck, and it's such a great little moment. And then think of Friday the 13th part 8 where a guy gets his head boxed off and there's no blood or anything. It's just a little dummy head flying through the sky. It's that kind of thing.
Exactly. And just like I said, Google the Superman and Batman comics of the 50s, just go ahead and look at where slasher franchises were at the end of the 80s and the early 90s. Like, look at Halloween 6, look at Freddy's Dead, look at
Yeah.
Jason Goes to Hell, you know, look at like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Next Generation. And if anybody's a fan of any of these, I'm not criticizing because I own them all.
Yeah,
But
let me say I'm a fan of all of these, but you can tell.
yes, you can tell that these went from, and then you just watch where they started from, like
Mhm.
John Carpenter's Halloween, Wes Craven's Nightmare on Elm Street, like the first Friday the 13th, like you mentioned. And it's like night and day difference. Like they become like cartoonish evil superheroes in
Right,
the
yeah.
later installments. So I can imagine as a horror fan, like besides Freddy's glove coming out and grabbing Jason's mask, I can imagine a horror fan coming out of like Jason Goes to Hell and being like, that was so far from what I wanted, you know, or like Freddy's Dead, and just being like so disappointed with where the big horror franchises were at the time. And
Mhm.
then turning on Tales from the Crypt and seeing these really dark, like ironic, sometimes almost cynical horror stories where like the people don't get out in the end and like really bad things happen to people, you know, and it like actually hits you. Like, the show came along at the perfect time in the same way that comics came along at the perfect time.
Oh, absolutely. I think well, I mean, this is the point, especially in comics. I mean, comics were doing fantastic, I think, in the 80s, and we're really pushing the envelope. And I think that was such a perfect time for this show to come around, for the reprints of Tales from the Crypt and just all EC comics in general to kind of really start going. Because I think that was a period where they could really start to be embraced, as slasher movies were becoming more and more censored and pedestrian, I feel. It was a perfect storm, and I think that's why the show succeeded so much, and that's why we ended up getting like 7 seasons.
Exactly. And people forget just how huge Tales from the Crypt was in the 90s.
Oh, it was massive.
I have a Crypt Keeper action figure still in packaging that was sold at like KB Toys. Like, not, this wasn't like, McFarlane Toys making like a highly detailed collectible action figure. No, these were like action figures sold at Walmart and Toys R Us and KB Toys that were marketed to kids. There was like Tales from the Crypt Keeper, the cartoon. There was Tales from the Crypt Keeper's Haunted House, which was a game show. Like I remember in a documentary about Tales from the Crypt, the one of the main like creative overseers, I do not remember the name, I apologize, but one of the people who like oversaw the franchise at the time said that his goal was to make the Crypt Keeper Halloween's equivalent of Santa Claus.
Right.
And like, I obviously Tales from the Crypt probably doesn't mean a lot to a younger generation right now, but I think at the time he succeeded because the Crypt Keeper was everywhere.
Oh yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, a Tales from the Crypt Keeper, which I have seen. It's insane to think of like, oh yeah, this really weird adult horror show ended up having a children's show spinoff, which had some fairly decent episodes to it and had the same morality tales going on. And then there was the game show too. It was so massive in the 90s. And you could just look back at everything that they did with it to kind of get that idea that like, yeah, this was a phenomenon when it happened.
Right.
This was the late 80s, early 90s version of like how big The Walking Dead was back in the day.
Exactly. And what I think what kind of occurred to me as I was rereading and rewatching these and just getting them fresh in my head again was one of the things that I love, or what appeals to me most about horror, is that it's a genre that relies a lot of the time, it relies heavily on the sense of community, because that community is often disrupted by whatever monstrous force is the antagonist of the piece.
Right.
So, like you watch, like, again, one of my favorite movies of all time, you watch John Carpenter's Halloween, and it's this sleepy little town, and Michael Myers is going to come through it like a storm, or Nightmare on Elm Street. It's a group of, friends who are just, enjoying being teenagers. And then all of a sudden there's a supernatural force that makes its way into their lives. Community is such a huge part of horror to me in terms of the storytelling, because I think it's so much more effective when you establish a place that you want to go. Like, and what I mean by that is, like, people always talk about watching The Lord of the Rings, right? And they're like, it feels like going home again. If you can do that in a horror story, the antagonist is going to be so much scarier. And what I think is so great and makes Tales from the Crypt so fun is a character like the Crypt Keeper establishes like a real world sense of community, where he's your friend that's telling you these weird stories. And it takes people right back to like when they were in like elementary school and used to tell ghost stories like at sleepovers, or like they'd tell like urban legends on the playground. Like, that's what the Crypt Keeper is. And I think the power still holds in that idea.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even today, I still feel like you'll have people that at least know who the Crypt Keeper is. They'll know of the character, and they feel like, I've seen that somewhere before. I don't know where, but I've seen it. That's how much of an icon I feel like they made this whole entire franchise, this whole brand, basically. And that's remarkable for a horror thing, because you get your horror slasher icons like Jason and Freddy, but to turn like an anthology icon into this big community character that everybody kind of rallies around is Major. And the only one I can think of since like maybe like Sam from Trick or Treat or Pennywise from It, it's these characters that people latch onto, and there's just something about them. Usually it's their personality or just the way they handle themselves that just gets people invested. And that's what makes these characters become pop icons. And that was definitely the case with the Crypt Keeper.
Exactly. And I just had this thought occur to me right now, but like, you would think in an era where everyone is so connected through social media that this would be the perfect time to do Tales from the Crypt again, because like, well, also every like IP now is based on nostalgia. Like every single nostalgic franchise in the history of pop culture entertainment is getting some kind of reboot right now.
Well, we are definitely in the age we've moved. We're still in the 80s nostalgia era, but we're also bleeding into the 90s nostalgia era big time. So
and I guarantee you, if like HBO Max did an original Tales from the Crypt like streaming series, if we brought it back, it would be huge. And you could, and this is obviously going to descend into like the Crypt Keeper doing TikTok and stuff, which is not what I'm advocating. But what I'm saying is like the idea that you could use social media and the internet and just sort of this instant access to information that we have now, you could have that Crypt Keeper brand showing up like on people's phones, on their laptops, like on their Twitter, like everywhere. Like, and it would almost be like reestablishing that sense of community that the Crypt Keeper had for people that switched on their TVs in the 90s. And I think Tales from the Crypt absolutely is due for another iteration.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just look at like when a major horror franchise is kind of reestablished. I mean, look how big the last 2 Halloween movies were. And that was only possible because eventually the series did fade out for a good number of years. And I mean, hell, you could say it faded out for 20 years after Halloween 3, basically. It never really reignited as much. But when it came back and it came back strong, it was a massive success. So I feel like Tales from the Crypt kind of lends itself to that, because nowadays I think it's easier than ever to pull aside a couple of creatives and get one person to direct just an anthology story that they've wanted to do, either from the comics or at this point so many of them have been adapted from the EC. Make up your own fucking story that feels in line with what Tales from the Crypt would be. Maybe, and even then, what helps it even more so than like, say, if you were to do a Twilight Zone nowadays, you don't need to get Jordan Peele to pretend to be Rod Serling. Instead you have the Crypt Keeper. I know John Kassir, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. He's still going, he's still around, he still does the voice very well. And I feel like you could totally just revive the show now. It would be so easy, especially now that they have HBO Max. That's a major place to do it now. You don't have to worry about like, oh, will this be successful on television? Doesn't matter now. People can watch it whenever they want to. And I know there were talks like 10 years ago about doing a revival with, I think, M. Night Shyamalan, maybe. I forget who was involved specifically. And it never went anywhere because at the time they were like, oh, it just wouldn't work on TV right now. It's like, okay, cool. Streaming exists now.
Exactly. And in a way, like this is almost like what Quibi tried to tap into. Because like with Tales from the Crypt, you could have 22-minute horror short stories that like people can watch on their phone between their classes. And I'm not advocating for the Quibi model where, like,
bring it back, damn it.
No, I'm not like advocating for that, where it's like shoot it in landscape and portrait, like not that, but what I'm saying is like it can appeal to people who are kind of like on the go and just want like a quick horror story. It could, everyone can download the HBO Max app on their phone or their laptop and watch it when they're in an airport or on their break at work. I like that you brought up the Twilight Zone reboot that they did on CBS, on then CBS All Access, because where I think that if there's fans of it, I'm not criticizing or anything, but I think where that failed, where the Tales from the Crypt could succeed, is that Tales from the Crypt doesn't have any like one iconic episode where like people are like, oh, Tales from the Crypt, bam, I remember that episode. Like they have like vague memories of it, but like with the Twilight Zone, Everybody knows William Shatner on the plane. Everybody knows Burgess Meredith dropping his glasses. Everybody knows the masks. Everybody knows all of these like iconic episodes.
Yeah.
And then when you try and like remake them, it's just sort of, it's remaking things that people have seen 1,000 times and they know and love. Whereas Tales from the Crypt is like, I don't think there's going to be anybody screaming that like, oh my God, they, you know, the one where the guy is on a boat with a rat or whatever, like, oh my God, they messed that one up. Like,
Right.
like, and I'm not criticizing Tales from the Crypt, but it just doesn't have that like zeitgeist grasp.
It doesn't have that kind of reverence where, you know, Twilight Zone specifically worked when it came out because of Rod Serling and because of the spirit of the show, and you have to kind of keep in line with that, where Tales from the Crypt is very irreverent. It's cynical. It doesn't really care.
Right.
That's a big part of it, is that, you know, just go all out, basically. Where Twilight Zone, you have to tell like these kind of reserved, powerful stories consistently, whereas Tales from the Crypt is just go for it, go crazy.
Exactly. Like and that's a great thing that you brought up too, is that Twilight Zone, regardless, you know, like I know Richard Donner directed a couple episodes of the Twilight Zone and all that kind of stuff, but like regardless of who was directing it, it was always Rod Serling's voice, both literally and, you know, narratively.
Right.
Whereas Tales from the Crypt was all about collaboration. Like it was all about bringing in new talent and different types of voices to create this. So that's why I think it's more in line for a reboot than something like the Twilight Zone, which is so codified and sacred at this point, as it should be, because it's one of the greatest television shows ever made.
Yeah.
But it's like, you know.
Also, I mean, let's consider this. The Twilight Zone's been rebooted 3 times now.
Exactly.
There's been like one for every decade since the 80s. Maybe we should lean off on that a little bit.
Right. Exactly. It's like but Tales from the Crypt had, you know, post Bordello of Blood, like there's not much Tales from the Crypt. I mean, I know there was like the straight to DVD movie, but that's exactly my point. There's not in the zeitgeist of Tales from the Crypt. It's been long enough that I think HBO Max could absolutely do a revival of it, and it would be quite successful.
Right. And I mean, hey, you know what? If a little smaller streaming service like Shudder is able to do a Creepshow TV show and do it very well, I feel like HBO could manage to do a Tales from the Crypt show again.
HBO, just get S. Craig Zoller to do the pilot, and you're golden. You're golden.
Please, we want more.
Yes, and hire me and Martin to work on it too, please.
That would be preferable. Thank you very much. Well, a couple things I do want to bring up before we bring this episode to a close. Obviously, we did mention this episode was directed by Walter Hill, and I do think you see a lot of his style, especially in this, and especially with the character of William Sadler. And I did like that you brought up you brought up that he feels like a taxi driver-ish kind of character, where he has that kind of, you know, noir protagonist antagonist feeling to him. And I mean, that's kind of obvious. And like, you know, Walter Hill did The Warriors and Streets of Fire, which have those kind of feel that has that grungy feeling to it a lot. So that was just a part of his, where you could definitely see, like, you could see Hill's style in this episode for sure.
Right. And it was embraced, which is why this show is so awesome, because you get a little mini horror short film from these great directors, you know.
Exactly. Now, before we say goodbye, and I maybe throw in a little trivia, because I did find something interesting about this episode. Do you have anything last minute things you want to say about this one?
Well, I just want to say that, like, I think it's rides that line of like disturbing and fun really, really well. And I think this and All Through the House, and then the episode we're going to cover next, Dig That Cat, I think it really sets a great template for like the rest of the show to follow. And I mean, to me, they're like the trinity of great Tales from the Crypt episodes. So.
Absolutely. And they're landmark episodes. Now, okay, I feel like I'm good enough to throw in a little trivia for you.
Sure.
The first one I just wanted to mention, I think this is more just my own observation. The first guy that gets electrocuted when William Sadler's going all crazy and everything, and he's running around murdering people. The guy that gets electrocuted by grabbing the gate, I didn't fact check this, but I'm fairly certain. I think that's the biker from Terminator 2 that gets thrown through the window onto the grill in the bar scene.
Okay.
I believe that's him because
Awesome.
I recognize that haircut in that face because he's got a very
Right,
rugged
right, right.
face. I'm like, that's a character actor right there.
Right, right, right.
Yeah. Now the certified trivia that I did find is that originally William Sadler was not auditioning for this role. He wasn't auditioning to be the lead. He was auditioning to be the detective that catches Talbot at the end, which is such a small, like
Okay.
minute-long role. But he asked
Right,
while
right.
he was auditioning for that, he asked them like, could I please audition for this too? And they were like, sure, go for it. And he knocked it out of the park and they hired him for it, which is great. But you want to know who else was in the running for the main character?
Lay it on me.
They were interested in getting Christopher Walken or John Malkovich.
Oh, that would. I want to see those alternate versions. I mean,
Right.
William Sadler is so awesome in this. I wouldn't trade him for anything, but I
Right.
want to see those alternate versions.
Right, exactly. I wouldn't want to give up William Sadler's amazing performance, and obviously his performance is so great. That's why they went with him over two fucking stars like Walken and Malkovich. But I would love to see those versions too.
That is awesome. That is just even imagining that what the alternate versions of this could be is
Right.
really
Them as this kind of character would be great.
yes, exactly. And hey, you know, we could still do if HBO Max reboots and they readapt this, they could
Right.
count for them still. So
Yeah, Christopher Walken and Malkovich are both kind of up there. They kind of look like the version of the character in the comic now. We could do it. We could totally do it.
oh yeah, and they could market this one as being more faithful to the comic,
Right, exactly.
which is how they market every reboot in pop culture.
That's right.
It's more faithful, but
Right.
anyway, like yeah, no, it's that is awesome, and that just goes to show like how many resources and how much talent they were working with on this show.
Oh, definitely. And as we talk more about future episodes, you'll definitely see a lot of big stars pop up on this show. I'm just excited for when we talk about Christopher Reeve, but that's down the line. So
yes, it's going to be fun, but we will be back, everybody. So thank you for listening to this episode, and next episode we're going to cap off the trinity of premiere episodes of this series. So
that's right. Hope you guys all enjoyed listening to us prattle on about the man who was death. And next time we're going to talk about Dig That Cat, He's Real Gone, which another one of my all-time favorites from this show. So I'm very excited to talk about that when we get to it. So until then, you all take care now and watch some more Tales from the Crypt. And please send HBO Max like a letter or an email now, I guess nowadays. Just send them an email requesting a reboot because we need it.
Yes, and put our names on that request, please. Because
yes, please. Yeah, please. Oh, and also release a Blu-ray copy of the show, please. I would really appreciate that. I just want to see it in HD. God damn it.
Yes, exactly. And put it on HBO Max.
And put it on HBO Max. That's the easiest one.
Yeah. Now that we're past all of that, now that we're past all of our requests for this second episode, thank you everyone for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Catch you next time, everybody. Take care.